Everyone says they want to help the poor. But how do we do that when we can't even agree on what poor means?
One of the most important measures of a society is how we treat our most vulnerable members. So if we want to be successful, we have to care a lot about poverty. Where you draw the poverty line is really a societal judgment that needs to be made. It can't be determined by science. It's a reflection of society's determination about how much is enough to no longer be deprived.
1964. Faced with rising economic hardship across the country, President Lyndon Johnson launches his War on Poverty, an ambitious series of legislative initiatives that would empower the federal government to assist poor families with basic necessities like food and healthcare. Thus was born the modern welfare state in America, and with it, the official poverty measure, or OPM. This formula was used to calculate a so-called poverty line, in which everyone who fell under a certain income threshold was considered poor and therefore eligible for assistance. This assistance, in the form of programs like Medicaid and SNAP, now command well over 10% of the federal budget. Ensuring that all these taxpayer dollars are being spent effectively means being sure that the OPM, created almost 6 decades ago and, minus adjustments for inflation, essentially unchanged since then, is still working as any good poverty measure must. Accurate enough to identify the most vulnerable among us, and sensitive enough to measure the effect of financial assistance on their lives. Unfortunately, few economists today think that the OPM is meeting either of these needs.
Going back to the 1980s, people have been very aware of the problems with the official poverty measure. As we provided more assistance through refundable tax credits and non-cash transfers, more and more the official poverty measure is missing all that we're doing to help low-income families. So the Census Bureau in the 1980s put out experimental poverty measures which address this. Researchers have been doing so. And then about 15 years ago, the Census Bureau started publishing what's called the supplemental poverty measure. And that's sort of the Census Bureau's attempt to correct the deficiencies of the official measure. Now, the Census Bureau has been publishing both the supplemental poverty measure and the official poverty measure together since about 2010.
In other words, we now have 2 government measurements of poverty: the OPM, which generates the poverty line and is thus still the sole source for determining who is eligible for government assistance, and the SPM, which attempts to give us a more comprehensive picture of poverty in America, accounting for government assistance in their calculations. Now, if you're asking yourself why we still bother with the OPM if it has so many problems, well, it's important to remember just how many entitlement programs are tied to the poverty line and, by extension, to the OPM. Any unilateral move to shift this line by recalculating its underlying formula could suddenly affect benefit eligibility for millions of low-income Americans, an outcome that no policymaker takes lightly. That said, efforts to replace the OPM with the SPM have been gaining steam in the last decade or so, but even beyond its potential effects for welfare recipients, some experts have also raised concerns about how the SPM could cloud our long-term understanding of the available data.
The problem with the supplemental poverty measure is that while it corrects for some of the problems with the official measure, it includes these in-kind transfers, it adjusts for taxes, it makes some pretty radical changes to the poverty line. It goes away from what's called an absolute standard, where you hold the poverty line fixed in real terms, and instead moves to a relative poverty standard. The problem with a relative standard is that if everybody gets better, then you won't necessarily see progress according to a relative poverty measure, because you're always measuring the low-income population compared to the middle-income families.
To illustrate the difficulty with this kind of moving yardstick, imagine you're climbing a mountain. Let's call it Mount Relative. Your goal, naturally, is to reach the peak, but Mount Relative is no ordinary fixed object. Instead, as the number of people approaching the summit grows, the higher the summit itself grows to compensate. As you can imagine, it would be difficult for you to ever reach the top, let alone know how much progress you've actually made. This is essentially what happens to the poverty line under the SPM. No matter how much life improves for the lowest income Americans in absolute terms, the SPM could still call them poor compared to their peers.
It really confuses the debate. It makes us think that we're not achieving progress when we actually may be doing so. So if middle income families see their incomes grow by, say, 10% in a given year, if you see low income families also increase their incomes by 10%, we're not going to see any change in relative poverty. And that's a problem, because what we care about is that everybody's being made better off, not necessarily that low-income people are doing even better than middle-income families. What we care about is capturing the most deprived individuals and families and calling them poor. If we don't do that well, we're not going to allocate our programs well and not measure our success as well in terms of lifting people out of poverty. So it's really important that we capture the most deprived families.
Even though the country hasn't come to a consensus on the best means of measuring poverty, most experts agree that fighting poverty is a worthwhile goal of the government, that anti-poverty measures have been broadly beneficial to low-income Americans, and that we have made real progress in reducing poverty. However, there remain a persistent minority of voices who have disputed this consensus. Some have pointed to the official poverty measure to claim that we've seen little or even no progress in over 50 years in reducing poverty. Most economists remain dubious, and some wonder if their motivations are less economic than political.
The problem I have with these other claims is that they mislead us into thinking that we have not made that progress. It makes people attack some of the fundamental components of our economy and our society that lead to these positive outcomes. My co-authors and I looked at what happens over the past 60 years since the war on poverty was declared to the poverty rate once you include all of the programs that we provide to low-income Americans and you hold the poverty line constant in real terms. According to that measure, we've seen a 90% reduction in poverty over time, which is a dramatic success.
This kind of large-scale improvement could make it easy for policymakers to get comfortable, but there is an increasing understanding among economists who study these issues that financial success is only one component of overall well-being. One factor generating particular interest in the last few decades is what researchers call social capital. Social capital is an academic term that describes both the strength of our social connections to our families, our coworkers, our neighbors, and the benefits we derive from those connections. Things like being able to ask a neighbor for help when we're sick, or getting a ride to work when our car is in the shop. Recent surveys have shown that while financial stability has increased over the years, we have seen a noticeable decline in social capital corresponding to a drop in self-reported happiness. And while social capital is not directly or even indirectly correlated to the poverty line or measure itself, its impact on overall well-being raises an important question. What is the ultimate goal of our fight against poverty?
And so we need to have broader goals for individuals that comes not just from providing assistance when needed, which we want to do, but we want to make sure people are set up for success over the long term. That said, I think people still crave social belonging in strong communities and families, and the research is pretty clear that those things matter a lot as well. So I worry a little bit that we're losing sight of the importance of those institutions and that our policies could ultimately work against that.
In other words, a truly comprehensive welfare program must include not only financial support to lift individuals out of poverty, but also programs that offer an off-ramp from government dependency through investments in social capital and other means of self-sufficiency. As an example of the tension between these goals, consider the recent expansion of the child tax credit. This measure, when initially passed, offset the end-of-year tax burden for people with one or more kids and required the parents to be working to qualify. But during the pandemic, this was expanded into an advance payment system of monthly checks sent directly to the parents regardless of their employment status. This measure, now expired but which some policymakers want to bring back, has many economists worried that the credit will encourage dependency through being simply a modified form of universal basic income instead of a work reward.
If we absolve ourselves from that responsibility and instead turn to the IRS providing checks each month to low-income families, we're not going to have that success, and we're ultimately going to fail low-income families. While it's true that when you provide resources to low-income kids, it improves their outcomes, that improvement is the strongest when that income is tied to work by the parent. So if we turn away from a tax credit that rewards work and turn it into guaranteed income, that can actually reduce some of the success we've had in improving child outcomes over time. And so we need to not lose sight of the fact that we want to reduce poverty, but do it in a way that promotes self-sufficiency and deeper connection and reliance on family and community and broader civil society.
Perhaps we can never truly win the war on poverty, but if we believe that it is a war worth waging, we must equip ourselves with the proper tools for the fight. 6 decades of data from federal welfare programs has created a lot of consensus about the best way to do that, but it has also added fuel to many long-standing policy debates whose outcomes have the potential to dramatically reshape how we address poverty in America. On the administrative side, adopting a relative poverty line, such as the supplemental measure, would certainly give us a fuller account of American families' income sources, but at the potential cost of being unable to accurately interpret that data and measure our success over time. On the legislative side, the growing call for something like a universal basic income, while well-intentioned, threatens to ironically deepen inequalities by encouraging government dependency. At the end of the day, we must remember that as a society, it holds great significance how we treat the most vulnerable among us. While we may not have won the war on poverty, we should celebrate that our efforts to date have in fact made a difference in the lives of many Americans.
So however you measure it, we've seen substantial increases in income over time. Each generation is better off than the previous one, and that holds for millennials as well, despite some of the recent statements to the contrary. And we should adopt policies that promote economic growth, that can reduce taxes when possible so that people can be better off over time. I think the ultimate goal of our anti-poverty programs, one, is to reduce poverty. I don't think we're ever going to eliminate it because there's always going to be people who fall through the cracks, who should be working but who are not, or just fall on tough times temporarily. But I think we can do a lot to reduce poverty, but that can't be the end of the story. It has to be much broader than that because people themselves don't only care about their financial well-being. They care about something more than that. They want to be attached to a job. They want to have strong families, and they want to have strong communities. And if our safety net only focuses on the material side by providing cash and being done with it, we're going to fail people and their families.